There are 9 seconds between the moment a commander requests a NATO airstrike in Bosnia and the moment the request enters a bureaucratic chain that will kill it. Not metaphorically, literally. In the spring of 1994, a 4-man SAS team was pressed into a building on the outskirts of Gorazde, a town of roughly 65,000 Bosnian Muslims surrounded on every ridge by Bosnian Serb artillery. The team had been inside the enclave for days, running grid coordinates of armored columns to a radio operator who relayed them upward through the UN chain of command, which relayed them to NATO, which consulted with UN civil authorities in New York, which referred back to member state governments, which weighed political risk, which passed guidance downward again through NATO, which passed it again to the UN's military commander in theater, who had to countersign any strike authorization alongside his NATO counterpart. The process was called the dual-key system. 2 keys had to turn simultaneously before a single jet would roll down a runway. 1 key was held by the UN, 1 was held by NATO. In practice, the keys were held by committees, and committees do not move at the speed at which a shell travels from a Bosnian Serb artillery piece to a Bosnian Muslim hospital. The SAS team in Gorazde had a laser target designator. They could paint a Serb tank at 300 meters and guide a precision weapon onto it inside a minute from the moment aircraft were airborne. The aircraft were airborne. The tanks were moving through streets. The request was in the system. The system was deliberating. One of those 4 SAS soldiers did not come home from Gorazde. The UN's approval process was still running when he was killed. That is not the most disturbing part of this story. The most disturbing part is what the man who ordered that mission did next. He did not wait. He did not ask again. He did not file a complaint with the chain of command. Lieutenant General Sir Michael Rose, former commanding officer of 22 SAS, former director of Special Forces, and since January 1994, the commander of UN forces in Bosnia-Herzegovina, looked at the bureaucratic architecture that was killing civilians and soldiers under his watch, decided it was insufficient for the situation he was actually in, and began operating around it. Not loudly, not in defiance of written orders, but with the institutional confidence of a man who had spent 2 decades in a regiment built on the principle that small groups of determined people could accomplish things that large permission-seeking organizations could not. The Bosnian War was an international armed conflict that took place in Bosnia and Herzegovina between 1st April 1992 and 14th December 1995. It was triggered by a familiar collision of forces: the disintegration of Yugoslavia after the death of President Josip Broz Tito in 1980, the rising tide of Serb nationalism under Slobodan Milosevic, and the declaration of Bosnian independence in March 1992, which Bosnian Serb military forces answered not with political negotiation, but with artillery. The army of Republika Srpska under General Ratko Mladic did not contest territory the way modern European armies are supposed to contest territory. It shelled markets. It sniped civilians queuing for bread. It surrounded Muslim towns with heavy weapons and waited for the population to starve or flee or die of cold. With evidence of images and accounts describing civilians being forced from their homes, starved, tortured, sexually assaulted, and killed based on their ethnic identity, it did not take long for the UN to call on its members, including the United States and its NATO allies, to stop the warring factions from committing further crimes against humanity. In response to the refugee and humanitarian crisis in Bosnia, the United Nations Security Council passed Resolution 743 on February 21, 1992, creating UNPROFOR. The UNPROFOR mandate was to keep the population alive and deliver humanitarian aid to refugees in Bosnia until the war ended. This mandate was deliberately narrow. It was vague, as neither politicians nor the UN wanted to involve the strictly peacekeeping force into belligerent actions, which could provoke an involvement of Western governments into a Yugoslavian all-out war. The practical result of that vagueness was that soldiers of professional armies, many of them among the finest in the world, were deployed into a war zone with orders that prevented them from stopping the war they were watching. They could escort convoys. They could report atrocities. They could not, under most circumstances, shoot at the people committing them. A large UN peacekeeping force, UNPROFOR, made mostly of NATO countries' troops, was deployed to Bosnia and Herzegovina from 1992 to 1995. British forces were among the earliest contributors. The 1st British Battalion Group, the Cheshire Regiment under Lieutenant Colonel Bob Stewart, deployed in late October 1992 through the Croatian port of Split, eventually headquartering itself in a school on the outskirts of the town of Vitez in the Lasva Valley. British armed forces would serve nearly 15 years in Bosnia and would see more than 50 comrades killed and many more wounded. What they found on the ground was a conflict that defied every framework the international community had assembled to contain it. UNPROFOR could monitor. It could object. It could write reports that went to committees who wrote further reports. But when Bosnian Serb forces overran a checkpoint, took peacekeepers hostage, or shelled a town declared a UN-safe area, the machinery of international response ground threw its gears with a slowness that felt, to the men on the ground, like complicity. After popular pressure, NATO was asked by the United Nations to intervene in the Bosnian War after allegations of war crimes against civilians were made. The mechanism through which NATO could act, however, was carefully hobbled by the dual-key system. Strikes were phased, with initial focus on suppression of enemy air defenses, coordinated through a dual-key system requiring UN and NATO approval to enforce compliance with safe area mandates around Sarajevo and other enclaves. In practice, this meant that every request for close air support had to travel up 2 separate chains of command, both of which had to agree simultaneously before a single aircraft could strike a target. The UN key was held by the Secretary-General's representative, a civilian official whose primary concern was preserving the diplomatic function of the peacekeeping mission. The NATO key was held by an alliance that operated by consensus and whose member governments had radically different risk tolerances and political calculations. Responses to safe area violations relied on this UN-NATO dual-key mechanism, requiring joint approval for airstrikes, which often delayed action due to concerns over Bosnian Serb retaliation against UNPROFOR hostages. Every time NATO moved towards striking a Serb position, Mladic's forces reached for the nearest group of UN peacekeepers and used them as insurance. Into this situation, on the 24th of January 1994, walked Michael Rose. Sir Michael Rose is a British military officer who commanded United Nations peacekeeping forces in Bosnia and Herzegovina during 1994 and 1995, during the disintegration of Yugoslavia. In 1968, Rose joined the fabled Special Air Service, with whom he conducted a number of undercover operations in Northern Ireland, the Middle East, and East Asia. He had commanded 22 SAS during the Falklands War in 1982, when the regiment had provided reconnaissance patrols that shaped every major operation of the campaign. He had served as Director of Special Forces in the mid-1980s. He was, by any measure, not a man who processed the world through bureaucratic categories. He processed it through the question of what needed to be done and who could do it. He was known to stroll the streets of Sarajevo, which were brimming with snipers without body armor. Rose arrived in Sarajevo and began immediately to take stock of what his command actually knew about the situation on the ground. The UN-safe areas, Sarajevo, Gorazde, Srebrenica, Tuzla, Zepa, and Bihać, were ringed by Bosnian Serb forces and in varying states of crisis. The total of casualties included over 1,500 children killed and nearly 15,000 wounded, according to a report by the UN Commission of Experts on the former Yugoslavia. Because of attacks on civilians, the UN Security Council had designated Sarajevo, and 5 other locations as safe areas, free from armed attacks and any other hostile acts. But the designation was a legal assertion, not a military reality. The safe areas were not safe. They were encircled, shelled, sniped at, and starved. What Rose needed was accurate, granular intelligence about what was actually happening in each enclave, intelligence that the UN's conventional information channels were not providing. Satellite imagery was imprecise. Reports from local commanders were filtered through layers of institutional hesitance. What he needed was people on the ground who could see, report, and, if necessary, act. He knew exactly where to find them. In 1994 and 1995, Lieutenant General Michael Rose, who had been the CO of 22 SAS and Director Special Forces during the 1980s, commanded the United Nations Protection Force mission in Bosnia and Herzegovina. Needing a realistic appreciation of the situation in a number of UN-mandated safe areas that were surrounded by Bosnian Serb forces, he requested and received elements from both A and D squadrons. The insertion was elegant in its simplicity. Elements of A Squadron covertly inserted into Bosnia, masquerading as the SAS Signal Squadron, then deploying as United Kingdom liaison officers working for the UN. The operators deployed with standard British Army uniforms, UN Blue Berets, and SA-80 assault rifles to hide in plain sight under the official cover as UK liaison officers. They established the ground truth in the besieged enclaves. They carried GPS navigation equipment. They mapped every position, every route, every Serbian artillery emplacement they could observe. They assessed the disposition, strength, morale, and weaponry of all forces, Bosnian Serb, Bosnian Muslim, and Croat. They reported directly to Rose, bypassing the conventional reporting chain entirely, giving him a picture of the battlefield that no amount of committee meetings could have produced. They were also equipped for something beyond observation. As these men were trained as forward air controllers, they were also equipped with laser target designators to guide NATO aircraft should the decision be made to engage Bosnian Serb forces. The phrase is careful and measured in the way that official descriptions of military operations often are. What it means in practice is this: small teams of British Special Forces soldiers were embedded inside besieged Muslim enclaves, carrying the precise equipment required to call and direct lethal airstrikes, operating under cover identities, in a war zone where their mission had not been sanctioned by the UN bureaucratic structure that was nominally in charge of the theater. Rose had not sought committee approval for this. Rose had decided it needed to be done, drawn on his authority as the senior UN commander in Bosnia, and done it. April 1994. The town of Gorazde in eastern Bosnia, population roughly 65,000, mostly Bosnian Muslims, besieged since 1992. In April 1994, NATO missions were about to be switched from close air support to airstrikes. Mladic and the Bosnian Serb army were on the move, already having launched an all-out offensive against the enclave of Gorazde, one of the UN-designated safe areas. Rumors of Serb atrocities against the Muslim population in and around the town of Gorazde prompted Rose to send the SAS in for a look. A small team, dressed in standard British Army uniforms and blue UN berets, was inserted into the town. The town was by this point surrounded on 3 sides, with Serb artillery on the high ground, firing at will into the urban area. Once inside, the SAS took up position in a bank and called in regular situation reports. They were Rose's eyes inside a dying city, transmitting observations on Serb troop movements, artillery positions, and the condition of the civilian population. On the 10th of April, 1994, UNPROFOR called in airstrikes to protect Gorazde. 2 US F-16 jets bombed a Serb military command outpost near Gorazde. This was the first time in NATO's history it had ever attacked ground targets with aircraft. The Serb offensive paused. Then it resumed. In reaction to the NATO attack, the Bosnian Serb forces took 150 UN personnel hostage on April 14th. This was Mladic's standard response to any use of air power. Produce hostages, chain them to military installations, photograph them there, transmit the photographs to Western news agencies, and wait for the international community to flinch. The international community flinched with remarkable reliability. On the 15th of April, 2 British SAS soldiers on the ground, operating as air controllers on the front line, came under Serb heavy fire. During the siege of Gorazde, an SAS operator in UN dress was shot and killed as a patrol attempted to survey Bosnian Serb positions. The trooper's death was the first confirmed SAS fatality in Bosnia. He died doing exactly what Rose had sent him there to do, moving close enough to Serb lines to see what the satellite photographs could not show. The following day, the 16th of April, the crisis compounded itself. A Royal Navy Sea Harrier FRS, one of 801 Naval Air Squadron flying from HMS Ark Royal, was shot down by a Serbian SA-7 surface-to-air missile. The pilot ejected over Bosnian territory. The pilot ejected and linked up with the SAS. Eventually, the SAS, with the Royal Navy pilot in tow, managed to exfiltrate the area on foot for eventual pickup by helicopter. That extraction, 4 men moving through lines held by a force that had just killed one of their colleagues and shot down their country's aircraft on foot through terrain that was being actively shelled, was the kind of operation that never appears in official UN communiques. It was conducted by men who had not asked for permission to save the pilot's life. The same SAS team called in a number of airstrikes on armored columns entering the city, until they were forced to escape through the lines of encircling Serbian paramilitaries to avoid capture and possible execution. The escape was made on foot through the encirclement at night, across terrain the team had mapped during the preceding days. The Serb forces knew by this point that there were British special forces operating inside the town. The team knew that capture meant, in all practical likelihood, execution or indefinite detention in conditions the Geneva Convention would not recognize. They moved anyway, through the dark, using the routes they had charted, reading the ground the way SAS operators are trained to read ground, as a resource, not a barrier. In the end, NATO stopped air operations over Gorazde, and the Serbs agreed to halt their offensive in the area. The political settlement came after the loss of the SAS trooper, after the downing of the Sea Harrier, after Mladic's men got within 300 meters of the hospital and shelled it at will. The dual-key system had produced a response that was too slow, too conditional, and too easily leveraged by an enemy who understood that Western governments valued the lives of their hostages more than the lives of the 65,000 civilians they were supposedly protecting. In parallel with the Gorazde operations, an SAS team infiltrated through Serbian lines to reach the city of Sarajevo, which was surrounded by Serbian forces. Once inside, the SAS called in NATO airstrikes against Serbian positions. The Sarajevo mission followed the same pattern: insert covertly, establish observation posts, report, designate targets, wait for the institutional machinery to catch up with the operational reality. Sometimes it caught up fast enough to matter. Often it did not. On February 5, 1994, 68 civilians were killed and 142 wounded by a mortar round fired at the Central Market in Sarajevo. The market was not a military installation. The people killed in it were not combatants. They were people, buying food in a city that had been under siege since April 1992, and they died because the system designed to protect them was slower than the mortar trajectory that ended their lives. Rose kept pushing. Within weeks, he had won praise from around the world for his ability to combine diplomatic skills with military judgment. He quickly became convinced that he did not have enough troops to guarantee keeping the peace. Partly as a result, he sought to talk, rather than fight, his way out of problems. That last observation, recorded by Britannica and reflecting the ambiguity of Rose's tenure, is accurate but incomplete. Rose understood that the UN mission was constrained by politics he could not change. He also understood that within those constraints there was a space for action that the constraints had not explicitly closed. The SAS operators working under UK liaison officer cover were not violating any written mandate. They were intelligence assets, legitimate under any reasonable reading of their deployment. The fact that they also carried laser target designators and were prepared to direct lethal strikes was a detail that the mandate had not addressed, which in Rose's reading meant he could address it himself. On October 17th, the UN announced that Rose would leave Bosnia in January 1995, at the end of his 12-month term. His successor, General Sir Rupert Smith, arrived in January 1995 and was considered the best UN commander, as he understood that the Bosnian Serb army and Mladic understood only the language of aggression. Smith inherited Rose's covert intelligence architecture and a political situation that had continued to deteriorate. Through the spring of 1995, Mladic was escalating. On June 4th, UNPROFOR Commander Bernard Janvier, a Frenchman, secretly met with Ratko Mladic to obtain the release of hostages, many of whom were French. Mladic demanded of Janvier that there would be no more airstrikes. What happened in the weeks that followed, that meeting would become one of the defining moral failures of the post-Cold War international order. Srebrenica, a Muslim enclave in eastern Bosnia. Long before July 1995, there were numerous indications that Bosnian Serb forces were planning a summer offensive against the safe area. Access for UN convoys was increasingly restricted, so that by late February and early March 1995, only one convoy per month was being allowed into the safe area to feed approximately 39,000 people. The enclave was being strangled slowly, in plain sight, with the full knowledge of the International Intelligence Services monitoring Bosnia. A two-man SAS reconnaissance team was covertly inserted into the UN safe area of Srebrenica, where a Dutch UN battalion was supposedly protecting the population and thousands of Bosniak refugees from threatening Bosnian Serb forces. The team was inside the enclave when the Serb offensive began on the 6th of July, 1995. By July 1995, only 400 lightly armed and poorly supplied Dutch peacekeepers remained in the town. When Serb forces launched a major offensive to take the town on 6 July, the Dutch forces deployed requested NATO airstrikes twice to halt the Serb advance. UN commanders repeatedly rejected the requests. The SAS team attempted to call in airstrikes as Serbian forces attacked, but were frustrated by UN bureaucracy and ineptitude. They were finally ordered to withdraw, and the city fell to the Bosnian Serb army, led by General Ratko Mladic in July 1995, resulting in the genocidal execution of some 8,000 civilians. Those two sentences contain a compression of horror that the language of an official account cannot fully hold. Two trained British forward air controllers with laser designators, with radio links to aircraft flying overhead inside the enclave, could not get a strike authorized in time to matter. They were ordered to withdraw before the city fell. They withdrew. The Srebrenica genocide was the killing of more than 8,000 Bosniak Muslim men and boys. It was the worst act of mass murder in Europe since World War II. NATO bombers attempted to attack Bosnian Serb artillery locations outside the town, but poor visibility forced NATO to cancel this. Further air attacks were canceled after Bosnian Serb threats to bomb the UN's Potokari compound, killed Dutch and French military hostages, and attack surrounding locations where 20,000 to 30,000 civilian refugees were situated. The system that had been designed to protect Srebrenica protected itself instead. It protected the diplomatic relationship with parties who were committing genocide. It protected the physical safety of a handful of lightly armed Dutch peacekeepers by abandoning the 39,000 people those peacekeepers had been sent to shield. In late May 1995, 6 weeks before the Serb assault on Srebrenica, then-Presidents Bill Clinton and Jacques Chirac, as well as then-British Premier John Major, reportedly agreed to suspend NATO airstrikes against Serb forces without alerting Dutch officials, contrary to the explicit commitments made to the Netherlands that such strikes would be provided within 2 hours of a Serb attack if needed. The Dutch commander on the ground made his requests. The requests went into the dual-key system. The dual-key system was connected to a political decision that had already been made at head of government level to suspend the very capability the system was supposed to deliver. The Dutch commander of the peacekeepers in Srebrenica asked for close air support 9 times, and it was also promised to him. But nothing arrived until it was too late, because behind this was an agreement between the 3 governments of the United Kingdom, France, and the United States not to use airstrikes anymore. The 2 SAS men extracted. Srebrenica fell. Mladic walked through its empty streets on the afternoon of the 11th of July, 1995, accompanied by his senior commanders, filmed by a Serbian television crew. Behind that triumphant procession and hidden from the camera, the machinery of genocide was already in motion. Men and boys were being separated from women and children. They were being taken to holding sites. They were being executed in fields, in warehouses, in forests, their bodies pushed into mass graves by heavy machinery. The massacre constitutes the first legally recognized genocide in Europe since the end of World War II. The Dayton Accords were signed in December 1995. Largely as a result of the bombing under Operation Deliberate Force and changes in the battlefield situation, the belligerents in the Bosnian War met in Dayton, Ohio in November 1995 and signed the Dayton Accords, a peace treaty. The implementation force, IFOR, was deployed in Bosnia and Herzegovina in December 1995 with a 1-year mandate. IFOR operated under Chapter 7 of the United Nations Charter, deriving its authority from UN Security Council Resolution 1031 of December 15, 1995. This gave it a mandate not just to maintain peace, but also, where necessary, to enforce it. For the first time in the entire conflict, NATO forces in Bosnia had rules of engagement that matched the reality they were deployed into. They could fight. They were permitted to fight. However, in the immediate aftermath of the Dayton Accords, NATO forces on the ground were largely hesitant to make arrests of war criminals, fearing potential destabilization and a resurgence of conflict. The ICTY had been indicting people since 1993. Radovan Karadzic, the political leader of Republika Srpska, and Ratko Mladic, the military commander who had personally overseen the Srebrenica massacre, were both under indictment. Neither was arrested. NATO's IFOR and then its successor, the stabilization force known as S4, patrolled a country where some of the most wanted war criminals in the world continued to operate, hold positions, move through public spaces, and in some cases remain in active military or civilian posts. The SAS had not gone home. In the aftermath of the Dayton Agreement in December 1995, the SAS remained active in the region, alongside JSOC units in the hunt for war criminals on behalf of the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia. Following the Dayton Peace Accords of 1995, members of 22 SAS also participated in the hunt for persons indicted for war crimes, alongside U.S., French, and Dutch special forces. The SAS, alongside other special forces units from countries like the United States, France, Germany, and the Netherlands, participated in a broader joint effort known as Operation Amber Star. This initiative, assembled at Patch Barracks in Stuttgart, Germany, aimed to provide the ICTY with the teeth it needed. The intelligence picture required to locate specific individuals in a post-conflict environment was built through the same methods the SAS had been using throughout the war. Covert observation, human intelligence, patient surveillance, the willingness to live inside an environment for extended periods without the enemy knowing you were there. Intelligence gathering involved extensive surveillance, human intelligence, and technical intelligence to pinpoint the whereabouts of fugitives. This often involved living covertly in Bosnia, blending into local communities, or operating from hidden observation posts. The first major post-war SAS operation against war criminals was designated Operation Tango. On July 10, 1997, a NATO SFOR-sanctioned operation was launched by the SAS in Bosnia against suspected war criminals. Operation Tango would involve simultaneous swoops on suspects in and around Prijedor. Prijedor was a town in northwestern Bosnia with a dark recent history. Milan Kovačević was the mayor of Prijedor in 1992 and was suspected of organizing the roundup of its Muslims for internment in the notorious camps at Omarska, Karaterm, and Ternopolje, where many were reportedly beaten and starved to death. Simo Drljaka was the former chief of Prijedor police, suspected of orchestrating the ethnic cleansing campaign that filled those camps. The location and identities of the two suspects had been confirmed by covert surveillance. Two 5-man SAS teams carrying indictments issued by the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia were inserted into the area by helicopter. The teams were assigned simultaneous objectives, timed to hit both targets at the same moment to prevent one suspect alerting the other. At the time of his arrest, Kovačević was the director of Prijedor Hospital. At 9:30 in the morning on July 10, 1997, a team of SAS moved in. The SAS talked their way into the hospital by posing as officials, their 9mm pistols concealed beneath their clothing. The SAS men arrested Kovačević, who did not resist. He was taken from the hospital, driven to a helicopter landing zone, and flown to the American base at Tuzla, from where he was transferred by C-130 aircraft to The Hague to face trial before the ICTY. Drljaka did not choose the same path. As the other SAS team moved in on the hospital, another team approached Drljaka, who was part of a fishing party at Prijedor Reservoir. Not prepared to go quietly, Drljaka opened fire on the SAS, lightly wounding a trooper in the leg. Drljaka resisted the arrest using a weapon. An S4 soldier was wounded, and S4 responded, killing Drljaka in self-defense. A man who had organized the systematic torture, starvation, and killing of thousands of Bosnian Muslims in 1992 died at a fishing reservoir 5 years later, having chosen to shoot at the men who had come to bring him to a courtroom instead of a grave. He did not get to make that choice successfully. The Bosnian Serb reaction to Operation Tango was outrage. The Republika Srpska government said that S4 had gone beyond the framework of the UN resolution. Your peace forces broke the rules and started with a hunt of Republika Srpska citizens. The Russian government called it a cowboy attack. The detentions took place in accordance with the Stabilization Forces mandate from the North Atlantic Council. The action had the specific authority of the Secretary General, the Supreme Allied Commander Europe, and the North Atlantic Council. Operation Tango was, unlike Rose's earlier intelligence operations, fully sanctioned through the official chain of command. It is worth noting the contrast. In 1994, Rose had operated around the institutional framework because the framework was preventing him from doing what needed to be done. By 1997, the institutional framework had finally caught up with what the SAS had been arguing all along, that the only way to deal with people who had committed genocide was to go and get them. The operations continued. In November 1998, another wanted war criminal was captured by the regiment from a remote safe house in Serbia. He was driven to the Drina River, separating Serbia from Bosnia, before being transported across in an SAS Zodiac inflatable boat and helicoptered out of the country. That operation crossed an international border into a sovereign state without that state's knowledge or consent. The man captured was Stevan Todorović, the police chief in Bosanski Samak in northeastern Bosnia, who was removed to The Hague and later sentenced by the tribunal to 10 years in prison. His crimes included beating a man who died as a result of the mistreatment, repeatedly beating 7 other men over a period of 8 months, and ordering 3 individuals over whom he had superior responsibility to torture a man. Less than 2 weeks after that operation, on the 2nd of December 1998, the most significant arrest of the post-war period was executed. General Radislav Krstić was traveling in a convoy near the village of Versari in the Republika Srpska in northern Bosnia when members of 22 SAS, backed up by a Navy SEAL unit, blocked off the convoy, disabled Krstić's vehicle with spikes, and arrested him. The indictment alleged that Krstić, as the commander of the Drina Corps of the Bosnian Serb Army, committed genocide during and after the fall of the UN-safe area of Srebrenica between July 11, 1995 and November 1, 1995. The tribunal's chief prosecutor, Louise Arbour, described Krstić as a very significant military leader and said she believed he was still serving in the Bosnian Serb Army. Bosnian Serb President Poplašen said the operation had obviously been organized in advance, noting that S4 was only supposed to arrest indicted war criminals when encountering them during regular duties. He said S4 overstepped its mandate during the arrest of General Krstić. It happened in a drastic way. This complaint is revealing in precisely the way its author did not intend it to be. Yes, the SAS had organized the arrest in advance. Yes, they had planned it deliberately. That was the point. The alternative, waiting until Krstić accidentally wandered past a routine checkpoint, would have been no different from the dual-key paralysis of 1994, a system architected to produce inaction while presenting the appearance of engagement. The Bosnian Serb authorities had spent 3 years after Dayton watching the international community fail to arrest the men on the ICTY's list. They had become accustomed to impunity. The SAS operation against Krstić was a direct communication that the period of accustomed impunity was ending, and that it was ending not through diplomatic notes or UN resolutions, but through men in black vehicles with spike strips and the authority to act. Kovacevic had played a key role in the crimes that occurred in the municipality of Prijedor. Most importantly, the establishment and operation of concentration camps targeting Bosnian Muslims and Bosnian Croats, including the Omarska, Karaterm, and Ternopolje camps. Krstić had commanded the Drina Corps at Srebrenica. Todorovic had organized the torture of prisoners in Bosanski Samak. These were not peripheral figures, not low-ranking soldiers following orders. They were the architects of industrial-scale atrocity, and they had been living as free men for years while the institutional community considered its options. The SAS brought them to The Hague. Not all of them, not Mladic or Karadžić, who remained free for years longer. But the ones the regiment went after, it got. And the method it used was the same method it had used since January 1994, when Rose had slipped his operators into Bosnian enclaves in UN Blue Berets and trusted them to tell him what no committee could, the truth of what was actually happening on the ground. There is a line that runs through the entire SAS experience in Bosnia, from the covert insertion of A Squadron's operators in the winter of 1994 to the Zodiac boat crossing of the Drina, with Todorovic bound in the back, and it is this. The regiment consistently saw the distance between what the institutional framework permitted and what the situation required, and it chose to close that distance, one operation at a time. Rose did not ask NATO's permission to put forward air controllers inside besieged Muslim enclaves. He was the commander. He assessed the need. He met it. His men died for it, and the men they were protecting were often killed anyway, because the strikes his operators were trying to direct could not be authorized fast enough through a system that measured urgency in committee schedules. The dual-key system was not incompetence. It was a rational product of the political reality of 1992 to 1995. A coalition of nations with different interests, different risk tolerances, and different domestic political pressures, trying to coordinate military action through a mechanism designed more to prevent unilateral action than to enable rapid response. UNPROFOR's limited effectiveness to deter attacks and provide protection stemmed from an approach to peacekeeping that was dependent on the consent and cooperation of the warring parties. The problem is that consent and cooperation are precisely what genocidal actors withdraw the moment they assess that the force opposing them will not act without both keys turning simultaneously. Mladic understood the system. He understood it better than the men who designed it. He timed his offensives for the gaps in the approval process and used UN hostages as physical locks on the second key. Rose understood this too, which is why he put his people inside the enclaves with laser designators and direct radio links and told them to paint the targets and transmit the coordinates, and then, with the institutional process running in parallel and often running too slowly, to do what they had been trained to do. The fact that the system eventually caught up, that the Dayton Accords gave I-4 the mandate that UNPROFOR had never been allowed to exercise, that S-4 eventually arrested Krustic and Todorovic and Anto Furunzia and others, is not a vindication of the institutional process. It is a vindication of the operators and commanders who kept pressure on the problem when the institutions were paralyzed. Anto Furunzia, a Bosnian Croat commander, was apprehended by the SAS in December 1998. He was subsequently sentenced to 10 years for torture. This case, and others like it, demonstrated that the hunt was not solely focused on Serb indictees, but on perpetrators from all sides of the conflict. Elements of UK Special Operations Forces, notably drawn from the 22nd Special Air Service, served in Bosnia, and were tasked with collecting human intelligence and identifying targets for NATO aircraft operating in support of UNPROFOR. That is the sanitized version. The fuller version is that a regiment founded in the North African desert on the principle that small groups of determined men could do what large organizations could not, took that principle to the most complex and morally charged military environment of the post-Cold War world, and proved it again. They went into Gorazde when no one had authorized them to go into Gorazde, because their commander looked at the situation and made a judgment. They rescued a Royal Navy pilot and dragged him through enemy lines on foot when the system had not planned for that contingency. They tried to protect Srebrenica from inside with everything they had, and they were pulled out when the system chose the safety of Dutch peacekeepers over the lives of 39,000 people. That last fact is not a failure of the SAS. It is a failure of every mechanism designed to prevent it, and the two men who were ordered to withdraw and who obeyed that order, knowing what it meant, deserve to have the weight of that obedience acknowledged. The SAS does not discuss these things publicly. The names of the soldiers who moved through the streets of Gorazde in April 1994, who extracted the downed Sea Harrier pilot, who held observation posts in Sarajevo, who crossed the Drina in an inflatable boat, who approached Droljaca at a fishing reservoir on a quiet Thursday morning. Those names remain inside the regiment. The record they left is not in memoirs or press conferences. It is in the ICTY case files, in the convictions of men who believed they had escaped accountability, in the handful of survivors from the enclaves who were protected by intelligence that a small group of men in blue berets gathered at extreme personal risk. The man who set all of it in motion, Michael Rose, left Bosnia in January 1995 after 12 months of operating in the gap between what was permitted and what was necessary. He had requested and received SAS assets under a cover that was not designed to permit what he was using them for. He had directed intelligence operations that went beyond any mandate the UN had issued. He had done it because he looked at the situation, consulted his own judgment, and decided that asking for permission was not faster than simply acting. That is not a philosophy that scales well to democratic institutions. It is not a philosophy that lends itself to comfortable examination in committee rooms. It is the philosophy of a man with 20 years in a regiment that had been built to operate without a safety net, who looked at the most dangerous situation in Europe and decided that the safety net was already missing and that the only question remaining was whether to act. He acted. His men acted. Some of them died. Some of the people they were trying to protect died anyway because the institutional framework was slower than the killing. And some of the killers, years later, found their way to The Hague because men in unmarked vehicles with spike strips and Zodiac boats had gone to find them in the places where the system had decided it was too complicated to look. The moral calculus of these operations is not simple. The men who planned them knew it was not simple. Michael Rose knew it was not simple. The SAS trooper who died surveying Serb positions in Gorazde in April 1994 knew in the few seconds he had to consider it that he was in a place he was not supposed to be by most conventional readings of his deployment. He was there because his commander had made a judgment and because the regiment had produced the kind of soldier who could be trusted with that judgment. The dual-key system, the committees, the diplomatic frameworks, and the institutional architecture of the international community produced Srebrenica. The man who decided he did not need their approval produced the best intelligence Rose had during the most critical period of the conflict, rescued a downed pilot in the middle of a siege, and eventually, years later, brought the architects of that siege to stand before their victims in a courtroom in The Hague. History should be precise about which of those outcomes required permission and which did not.